I gotta be honest, Linux software RAID is absolutely incredible. I've been on big systems, I've been on small systems, and I've used software RAID in places where people insist a hardware-based RAID solution is the only one that works. And part of the reason I like it so much is just how flexible it is. You can have your hard drives die, you can have the whole system die, and just plop out the remaining hard drives, put them in a new server, and it'll automatically build and recognize your RAID partition. If you try to do that with hardware RAID that's failed, oh my goodness, does it make for a bad day. I know from experience. But there are a few things you want to do to make sure your RAID experience is awesome. You want to make sure that your partitions or hard drives are matching in sizes. If your hard drives don't quite match, you can just make partitions that match exactly. And then also you want to set up a specific partition type, which doesn't necessarily mean it's the only way it'll work. However, you're going to want that if you happen to have a system that needs to be rebuilt. It is completely possible for you to use the actual device and create RAID partitions using the raw devices, but I don't recommend that. I recommend making partitions because that will allow you some flexibility. If your drives aren't exactly the same model number or the same exact size, you can create partitions that are the exact same size, and that will give you some more abilities when it comes to creating RAID partitions. So we're going to use all of these partitions, but we're going to use all these drives, but we're going to make partitions out of them so that we can use those partitions as the actual RAID devices. Again, you don't have to. This is just kind of a best practice, and it really makes it easy when you have drives that are different brands or different models, that sort of a thing. And another not necessary but really awesome idea to do when creating software RAID is to create a partition type of FD, which is just a hexadecimal thing. It doesn't stand for anything, but FD is RAID auto detect, which means that if you take those hard drives out of a system and put them into another system, that system is going to say, oh look, it's a RAID partition, and it's going to create that RAID device using those partitions without a whole lot of work on your part. So creating a partition and then making it the partition type of FD or RAID auto just makes things easier down the road. And thankfully it's really easy to do that in Linux because the tools are the same tools that we use to create any other partition on the system. We're going to use fdisk. On our Ubuntu workstation here, I am logged in as root, and I'm just going to type lsblk to see what we have on the system. Now we have SDA, this is our main system drive with its partitions and swap partition, but here I have 3 individual drives that I've added to the system. They're all 10 gigabytes big, and these are just 3 separate hard drives. There's no partitions on them now, they're just raw disks. Now we could use those raw disks to make RAID devices, but remember we want to create partitions because that's the best practice way to go about doing things. So I'm going to use fdisk, and I'm going to say dev sdb. Now I never remember the commands for fdisk, so I'm just going to hit M to give me all the commands here, and I want to add a new partition. So N, press enter. I want the default of primary partition, the default of partition number 1, so that's all the same. I'm going to go with the first sector available, which is the default, and then last sector. Now, if you have different size drives or different brand drives or even just different model numbers that don't have the exact same sectors, you may want to actually specify a particular size in gigabytes or terabytes or megabytes or by sector because you want them to all be the same size. Now, I know that my disks are the same size, so I'm just going to accept the default last sector of the hard drive so I get the most possible space. And sure enough, it says created a new partition, 1 of type Linux. All right, so that's the part that I want to change. Now, of course, it's 10 gigabytes in size. It's a maximum. That's cool. But I want to change the type of this. I don't want it to be Linux. I want it to be Linux RAID auto detect. So if we look back up here, I'm going to scroll up a little. We can see T is to change a partition type. So before I exit out, I want to hit T. And then it says the partition type that I want. Now, I know that I want type FD, but that's not something that would be normal to remember. So again, I'm just going to do capital L to get the full list of drive types available. And you see there are tons of partition types. Now here is the one that we want, Linux RAID Auto, and it's type FD. So I'm just going to type FD. Press enter. It says it changed the partition type from Linux to Linux RAID Auto Detect. And now if you remember, in order to save, I'm going to type M again just to give us the commands here. Right to the partition table to disk and exit. So W. Press W. All right, the partition table has been altered. So if we type lsblk again, now we should see, sure enough, SDB, we have SDB1 on there. Now I'm going to do the same thing to C and D. I'm going to go through it really quickly, see if you can follow along, because we just need to get them all set up the same. So when we create a RAID partition, or when we create a RAID device using these partitions, they're consistent and they're easy to go from system to system. So fdisk, dev SDC. You have to spell fdisk right. Way to go, Sean. All right, I want new partition, default, 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 default. Yes, type. I want the new type to be FD. Enter. W to save. Same thing again, but I'm going to say with SDD. New partition, primary. First one, default, default. T for change the type. The type I want is FD. Press enter, press W. How was that for awesomely fast? Now if we do ls blk, we're going to see, sure enough, we have all of these partitions, and they are of the right type as well. If we want to actually see the partition information, we could do fdisk -L to list, and here it will show us each of these individual devices. SDB is 10 gigabytes, and it has the Linux Auto RAID partition type. So all of these are set up and ready to be created into a RAID device, but this is how you go about setting up the drives so that later on, if you have to rebuild it in another box, it actually goes a lot smoother. My absolute favorite part about software RAID in Linux is just how great it is at recovery when something goes wrong with your system. So doing these steps to make sure that your drive sizes match and that the partition types are correct is really an important step before you create the RAID partition so that it is flexible and it is recovery in the case of an emergency later on. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.